This is Sunday Magazine. I'm Brian Hughes. My guest this morning, Admiral Joe Sestak, a candidate for the Senate seat in Pennsylvania, currently held by Pat Toomey. Good morning, Admiral.
Good morning, Brian. It's good to be with you.
Great to have you on the program. One of the main benchmarks that you're running for in this Senate campaign has to do with health care, which has been a very personal issue for you, has it not?
It is. I was in the Navy, as you know, 31 years. I loved it. I got married at 47. As I'd mentioned before, it was pretty hard to convince someone, but I did. A beautiful, wonderful woman, and we had our child. I'd come back from the war. I'd been gone for about a year, and a little while later, my daughter, who was 4 years old at the time, was struck with malignant brain cancer. Only 8% of kids have ever survived her type of brain cancer, and she's one of them. And we had wonderful health care in the military. She's 14 today. And because of that, I got out of the Navy, took care of her, and then I became a Democrat. I was an independent. I wanted to fight for health care for everybody. It was my payback tour for everybody for giving me my daughter in the military with our health care plan. So that is very personal, Brian.
Outstanding. And you're very much in favor of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. Now, I don't know if you watched any of the presidential debates Sunday night between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. It seems that Hillary is in favor of Obamacare as it exists now, just maybe tweaking a little bit, where Senator Sanders is more for a single-payer plan. How did you perceive the debate?
Well, I am a strong believer that the Affordable Care Act was a wonderful first step. We've actually have found out this past year that it was going to cost $100 billion less. And it's not just that everyone gets health care and access to it. What it does do now is permit people, young children like my daughter with pre-existing conditions, to be able to get health care no matter where they go. They cannot be denied. But more needs to be done. And here's my take on it. Medicare. Right now, Medicare cannot bargain for best drug pharmaceutical prices. They're forbidden from getting the best price in bargaining. VA, the Veterans Administration, can do that. Medicaid can, and we cost us $123 billion over the next 7 or 8 years because of that. So that is an enormous change that we could make, for example. The second one is what I thought that they should have brought up, is pay-for-delay schemes. That's where drug companies who get a brand-new drug with a patent for 10 years, they get exclusive rights to it. But then after 10 years, when their patent's about to expire and the more generic drug is going to be made at maybe one-fifth of the cost, they buy out that generic company, or they pay them not to produce it so that they don't have that competition. And that costs us about $4 billion a year. So there's a lot more that can be done just by doing practical things.
Now, do you think there's any possibility of restoring the public option, which was originally in the Affordable Care Act, but had to get discarded as part of the grand bargain to pass the ACA?
Well, there was some items that were actually in there. It wasn't called the public option, but after that, they had some care organizations that were set up that were going to have loans, and not grants, just loans that had to be paid back, approximately $6 billion, that would experiment with the idea of having kind of like a public option where you wouldn't have that high, often 17% administrative overhead that many of these private companies do, and they cost so much. Medicare has a very small overhead, about 3 or 4%. The problem is, unfortunately, that in the the partisan warfare down there, it got cut out of the budget, almost all of the $6 billion, just a little bit. So we were never able to take it to the another step and say, can you get another program out there that could make these private companies even be more competitive by not spending so much on advertising, so much on CEO salaries or other things. And so that never really came about, even though there was a sub-public option in it, so to speak.
This is Sunday Magazine. My guest this morning, Admiral Joe Sestak, Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Pennsylvania. Now, you ran for the Senate's, this particular Senate seat 6 years ago. What have you learned from that campaign as opposed to the one you're running right now?
How well we did, because people came to believe that I would actually be there for them. We lost by 2 small percentage points. And yet our gubernatorial candidate, supported by the Democratic establishment, lost by almost 10. And we were outfunded because of Citizens United, as Wall Street, as the Koch brothers and others rolled in to help now Senator Toomey. We were outfunded 3-1. And yet we came within 2 points. That's part of the reason that I turned down the lobbying jobs. I mean, my wife put her hand on my shoulders, Brian, when I told her the outrageous prices I was being offered to be a lobbyist and use my previous position for advantage for me. And I said, no, I went to teach instead. And she said, she kind of laughed, said, "You're sure, Joe?" I said, yes. So I taught at Carnegie Mellon, Cheney University, Penn State, Dickinson, Army War College, because I learned in that race, if you can talk with the people, earn their trust, you can win to serve them.
This is Sunday Magazine. My guest this morning, Admiral Joe Sestak, the highest-ranking military official ever elected to Congress. That's a pretty amazing feat.
Well, I was doing it because I owed this country. I never dreamed I'd be in politics. I voted, but that was it. But I owed the country because of my daughter's brain cancer. But, I worked on education. It was one of the most important committees I was ever on because it's our homeland defense to get affordable education for our children to go on to community colleges or to get a certificate to be a great welder or to go and become a 4-year and get a doctorate if you wanted to. But it's an increasingly dangerous world today, Brian. And I honestly believe that we have very few experts in the Senate. We had Democrats and Republicans who voted to get us in that tragic misadventure, that war in Iraq. People today don't understand that militaries can stop a problem, but we don't fix the problem with a permanent solution. Nobody thinks we fixed Iraq. And so how we need both on the Democratic side, because there really aren't anyone isn't there, nor running, and definitely the Republican side, where they sometimes think just use your military, that's the answer. My belief is I think I can also help bring wise experience in our military. I even worked in the National Security Council for President Clinton to make sure use our military, but use it when it needs to be used, not unnecessarily.
And I think we've just seen recently, where Iran is concerned, how diplomacy has worked out very well, not only with the nuclear deal, but also the release of 3 Americans and Iranian-American citizens that were held hostage there for quite some time.
Brian, that's exactly correct. When I was in the Persian Gulf in command of my carrier battle group, the George Washington Carrier Battle Group, and I had been on the ground in Afghanistan first as head of the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, then for a short mission, very short, then took command of the Carrier Battle Group for Afghanistan, then we began the precursor combat ops for Iraq. It was really tough there with the Iranians and a Navy and all. I sent off a message that actually said we need an incident at sea agreement, an sea agreement like we have with the Soviet Union in the old days, where if there was something happening at sea, you had a hotline to pick it up and call. Even though they were an adversarial nation, say, hey, let's quickly resolve this. And you could see that because of the Iranian Accord, where now Iran cannot have a nuclear bomb in 30 days, which it could have a few months ago, now it's at least a year and probably 10 to 15 before it would be even capable of building one. Now we were able to use the hotline between John Kerry, the Secretary of State, and the Foreign Minister of Iran to resolve a situation with our sailors and others and getting our prisoners out that we had no communications to do before.
Now, North Korea may be a bit of a different story given its questionable leadership there. Any possibility you see in the next 5 to 10 years possibly of any negotiations with the North? Absolutely there is.
And this means we have to use the strength of our leadership with China, which is basically having some pretty tough times of its own right now economically and doesn't want a problem on the doorstep with North Korea building more nuclear bombs. They have the capability right now today for over about 10. And so all of a sudden, Japan, South Korea, who are really under the gun, may start building nuclear weapons. So now's our time to use our leadership and force China to take the first step with us that says to North Korea, the 3 no's, as someone once said, no more nuclear bombs, no transfer of technology, and no enhancement of your nuclear weapons. If we can get them first to stop and then take the second step, with some economic relief, like we did with Iran, of doing away with it, there is a propensity that we can do there. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. There's no assurance. But my gosh, now with China having its own problems and doesn't want an arms race there in Northeast Asia with Japan and South Korea, there's a potential here for us to also, over the years, do the same thing we've done with Iran.
Now, you have offered a plan for restoring the American dream for working families. We already discussed health care. What are some of the other elements of that plan?
Well, when I was teaching at those 5 universities and colleges instead of lobbying across Pennsylvania, I wanted to teach. We studied the various aspects. So there's no one answer to fix the American dream to where you know that your child would have an opportunity to do better than you. And that dream hasn't been working. So it talks about small business growth, how we are only creating half the number of small businesses today as we did in the 1970s. And they create 70% of all jobs. It talks about manufacturing coming home and how wages, because of that, particularly if you can build the wind turbines that for green energy that China is building 99% of today, and other countries are, those are 5 jobs for every $1 million put into wind turbines because there's 400 tons of metal in it. Those are manufacturing jobs. It talks about the dream of home ownership because we're at the lowest home ownership, particularly in a long time, because students are graduating with big debt. And they're not buying their homes in the first 10 years like they used to. And then finally it talks about not just education, but innovation, how we can always remain the most productive nation in the best economy because we talk and work on innovation, and that is what drives our productivity, and to make sure that productivity becomes part of the wages of the workforce, not just the business owners.
All right, Admiral Joe Sestak, Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate for Pennsylvania. I'm sure there's a lot of more miles you have to cross back and forth across Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Make sure you get yourself a couple pairs of shoes before the primary, and, of course, even November should you be victorious in the primary. Appreciate you joining us this morning and sharing this information with us here on Sunday Magazine.
Thanks, Brian. It was great to be with you.